Today we celebrate the 6th International Day of Women and Girls in Science. I'm Katrina Nguyen-Robertson, my pronouns are she, her, and I am a Science Communications Officer for the Convergent Science Network. I am delighted to be your MC today. The International Day of Women and Girls in Science was first announced by the United Nations General Assembly in 2015, and it is now celebrated every 11th of February every year around the world. This day is about celebrating leaders and inspiring role models in science who are women and supporting the next generation of scientists. Women have contributed to major advances in science. For example, Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuelle Charpentier's groundbreaking work in gene editing won them the 2020 Nobel Prize in Chemistry. Their win marked the first time a science-related Nobel Prize was shared by women and no men. So that's at least one good thing to come out of 2020. Today, we are joined by two such incredible researchers from RMIT University, Dr. Kylie Quinn and Professor Sarah Spencer, recently promoted to professor, so well done. And they will share their experiences today. Kylie is a Vice Chancellor's Research Fellow at RMIT and leads the Aging and Immunotherapies group. She investigates how aging limits immunity in older individuals and how we might restore their immune function. Sarah leads the endocrinology of the Obese Brain Research Laboratory and is Deputy Program Leader of the Neurodevelopment in Health and Disease Research Program, also at RMIT. Her research focuses on understanding the long-term environmental and lifestyle influences on stress, metabolism, and immune function in the brain. Hopefully you've had a chance to watch their presentations, but just to briefly recap those presentations in case you didn't or you watched them some time ago, I might ask you each a question about your research. So Kylie, maybe I'll start with you. As we age, there are many changes to our bodies, and especially when we think about how our cells function. And your particular focus is immunology. So how does aging impact our immune cells?
Yeah, good question. If we think about aging and how it impacts immune cells, those immune cells are aging just like every other cell in our body. So as we get older, the cells within our body accumulate different forms of damage. So we can accumulate damage to our DNA, we can accumulate damage to our proteins, and damaged dysfunctional proteins can stick around and kind of clog the system up. We can have changes to the metabolism of our cells, the energy generation mechanism for our cells. And all of those things contribute to this broader process known as aging. All of those things also contribute to inflammation. So they're stressing the cells of our body out, and the cells respond by producing inflammation. So the cells of our immune system have a bit of a double whammy. They are aging, just like every other cell in our body, but they're also super sensitive to those inflammatory signals. So they're sitting in this soup of inflammation. They're getting all these signals. So it's like an alarm going off all the time. And so the cells of our body will respond by doing one of two things. And it's generally, if you think of an alarm going off all the time, you're either going to get really stressed out about it and try and respond to it, or you're going to ignore it. And so those are sort of the two options that the cells of our immune system are, the two paths that they can take. And that can lead to all sorts of different outcomes that we see with aging. So we can see an increase in autoimmune conditions because we've got some cells that are so stressed out and they start to respond. We've got also the other end of things where some of the things that our immune system should be getting rid of, it doesn't anymore. So we become more susceptible to infections and become more susceptible to malignancies and cancerous cells. And so that's kind of the what can happen during aging, particularly to the cells of our immune system. And we're really interested in understanding the mechanisms that drive that so that we can design better therapies for older people. And we're particularly interested in immune-based therapies, so vaccines, and what we call cell-based therapies for older people. So taking someone's own immune cells and using them as a therapeutic.
That's absolutely fascinating. And speaking of aging, looking at another side of it, when we think of aging, potentially cognitive function and memory come to your mind. So, Sarah, You found that key immune cells in the brain are activated due to sickness, high-fat diets, and aging. Could you please briefly explain the role that this plays in memory and cognitive impairment?
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity to be part of this. It's a really great endeavour. So Kylie's research focuses generally on whole body immune system, whole body immune cells. What we've been working with is more of a focus on the brain, and the brain has these beautiful immune cells called microglia that help respond to a pathogen, bacteria or a virus, or an injury, such as if you encounter a stroke or a traumatic brain injury or something, and they respond to clean up all the dead cells and restore the brain back to normal, essentially. And what we've found is, as Kylie suggested, as a person ages, these cells become hypersensitive or primed to hyper-respond to a challenge that comes along. And my group's been looking at the various types of environmental challenges that can trigger this response, particularly in aging. So we've done some work in collaboration with a fantastic collaborator in the United States, Ruth Barrientos. And what we did was we fed high-fat diet for just a really short time. So we've like, you have a Christmas period where you have too many get-togethers with friends and you're eating junk food for a short period of time. So essentially the equivalent to that, if you do that in a young subject, their memory is just fine. If you, if you're a young subject eating a normal diet or a young subject eating this sort of bingey kind of bad diet for a while, your memory is just fine. But if you happen to be aged and you're consuming this short period of high-fat diet, your cognitive function is impaired. And this is associated with more of activation of these microglial cells, these immune cells in the brain. And so what my research is doing at the moment is trying to understand whether the microglia are the good guys, in a sense, trying to combat all of these problems and restore cognition to normal, or are they the bad guys and they're contributing to this inflammatory environment in the brain and contributing to this cognitive dysfunction? And so we have a model where we remove microglia from the brain, and we have preliminary data to suggest that when you remove microglia from these aged brains that have been on a high-fat diet, their memory is actually better or restored more towards normal. So we're working on that and a number of other projects looking at the function of these cells.
Thanks, Sarah. You both studied very different aspects of immunology, and I just wondered what inspired you to pursue your specific field of research. Maybe Sarah, we'll start with you.
I think it was more a gradual evolution of the direction that I've taken. So I started off doing my honours year in a project that was related to gut function. So we were looking at changes in gut that happen with cystic fibrosis. And I sort of fell in love with the science, but wasn't so keen on working with gut. And so I transitioned into a PhD that was a neuroscience-based project that was looking at stress pathways in the brain, essentially how do your brain regions talk to each other when you happen to be stressed. And that kind of transitioned from there into a real love for neuroscience. And as my career has progressed, so has this understanding that neuroscience isn't just neurons. We have all these other cell types in the brain that can influence how our neurons behave. And so that's kind of morphed into this interest in how these immune cells in the brain can influence things.
Thanks, Sarah. And Kylie, how did you get interested in your area of research?
In terms of the specific area of immunology, again, it was sort of an honours year that lit that fuse for me, I guess. So I was at university, I was doing a double degree in law and science and genetics, because at the time, gene therapy was going to be the next big thing. And so that's sort of where I thought I was headed. And I was sort of in my, getting towards the end of my studies, and I had the opportunity to do a summer studentship in a lab. So off I went, and I just had the most amazing summer. I was finding results. I got bitten by the bug of getting new results in my hand. It was a study on understanding different vaccines and how they worked, and it felt so real and so vital. And I was contributing to the body of knowledge, which was really exciting. And then I came back to my honours year, And I was doing all this genetics, but I had one class in immunology, and it was just like a light going on. Like the first lecture was so exciting. There was this whole system in front of me, and I wanted to understand all the bits and how they worked. And so I was so inspired by that. I was talking to one of my classmates, and I was like, that was the best lecture I've ever been to. That was just fantastic. And she encouraged me to go and talk to the lecturer who was her supervisor, because it was his first lecture he'd ever given. And so I walked in and I was like, just wanted to tell you, I think I want to be an immunologist. And I think it was just this literally like a light bulb going on. And I really just loved the subject so much. And so then I went on, did my PhD working on vaccines, did a postdoc on vaccine design, and then I came back to Australia, and it was a bit challenging to get funding for vaccine research. It's ironic in the situation we're in now, but I decided, I could take my knowledge and try and use it in a different kind of way, and I was looking for opportunities for where my knowledge could have real impact, and thought about aging. And so aging, again, you take the system, the immune system. We've defined it so well in young individuals, but in aging, everything's just a little bit different. And it's been so neglected for so long that there's so many things that we don't understand. So the area is ripe for new understanding. And so that for me was how I've directed my research, particularly towards aging.
Thank you. Such, different reasons for getting into your field. So we can hear from your accents that you're both from New Zealand. So I wondered, what was it like moving from New Zealand to Australia for research? And I believe, Sarah, that you spent some time in Canada, and Kylie, for your postdoc, you spent a bit of time in the US. So what was it like, firstly, moving to Australia, and then what were your experiences like in academia overseas?
This profession I've chosen, it's an incredibly international profession. And I think that's a big aspect of why I love it so much is you have people from all over the world who are contributing their knowledge. There are no borders in that body of knowledge. It's really coming from everywhere. I think in terms of where I started in New Zealand, it was obviously a very small, intimate community of people, like-minded people who, I found my tribe. And we shared knowledge, shared that understanding, and it was a very supportive environment. And then going off to the US was all of a sudden I was a little fish in a big pond, very big pond. I think it was so helpful for me to understand the scale of things. There is a very big world out there. There are incredible research groups that are very well resourced overseas, and to understand that scale, but also to understand how the communication was happening overseas. There's these highways of discourse, of intellectual discourse across these different institutions, and it's so important that we plug into that and become part of that international community. And then I guess coming to Australia, it is a really vibrant community of incredibly smart, incredibly switched on, well-trained individuals. And so it's definitely, especially Melbourne, is just such a great place to do research. And that's why I specifically chose it for where I wanted to base myself with immunology. It's a great hub.
Thank you. And Sarah, you moved over to Australia a little bit earlier in your career. I believe you did your PhD here. So what was your experience like?
Yeah, so the first thing that comes to mind when you ask about what it's like to move from New Zealand to Australia is hot. So I moved from Otago University in Dunedin, which is down the south of New Zealand. And, the winters can be fairly bleak and rainy and things, to Brisbane in about the 20th of January, so about as hot of time of year as Brisbane gets, and just stepping off the plane in that environment and then into a kind of a student accommodation share house that didn't have air conditioning and this sort of thing. The climate was a big transition. But one of the things that really attracted me to a scientific career was the ability to travel with ease, and not just travel to visit a country, but travel to live there without having to requalify and this sort of thing. So it was always part of my plan. It was to go international and live in different places. And so I did my PhD in Brisbane at UQ, and then moved for a postdoc in Canada, which was another little bit of a culture shock, because I did a 3-year postdoc in Calgary, which is and I arrived in Calgary in the middle of their Stampede, which is it's like their show week. Everyone dresses up as cowboys. I kind of wondered where I had landed myself this time. But in each case, and then again when I moved back to Melbourne, the scientific community is really really supportive. The people are wonderful, and at each point you're learning a whole. The learning curve is really steep, but it's really encouraging to think that you can also bring something to the teams that you're moving into. So even moving from a PhD into a postdoctoral position, I was bringing skills that they didn't have already existing in that place, and obviously developing my skills as I went along. So I think those international moves are really important from networking perspective and just life experience. And also the travel associated with conferences, which unfortunately we didn't get to do last year, and maybe not this year either. You meet people in your fields that are doing the cutting edge research that you need to collaborate with, and that's how these partnerships develop, is over a glass of wine and some cheese after the plenary kind of thing. So I think that's sort of international communities and travel is really important.
Before we move away too much from this sort of train of thought, someone is asking, so Kylie, similarly to you, someone was interested in genetics and then ended up in immunology post-PhD, potentially because the only immunology talk, well, they were inspired by someone who presented well enough that they stayed awake for the entire immunology talk. So how important do you think it is to find inspiration like that? And do you ever feel a pull to go back towards genetics, or you're pretty stuck on immunology?
Look, you need to love what you do if you're working in science. You need to have a lot of enthusiasm for it. There are parts of it which are not fun and a bit boring, and but that enthusiasm, I think, for example, with genetics, I still use my genetics a lot. We need to understand a lot of genetics to understand some of the mechanisms of, some immunological mechanisms. So I don't think, you can have training in these different areas, but when I find it can be particularly valuable, and you can find some particularly interesting questions in science when you're at the intersection of different fields. And so if you do have training in a couple of different fields, then that gives you an advantage in terms of identifying those novel questions and novel things to go after. So, yeah, you got to love it, but it's fine to have some expertise that cross boundaries.
And definitely the Convergent Science Network, like if you think about the name, it's lots of science now. It's becoming more and more interdisciplinary. Like, you don't have to stick to one field. And thinking about sticking to fields, someone has a question for you, Sarah, who has recently graduated studying microbiology and immunology, but now this year going into their master's degree, starting to specialize in neuroscience. So the question is it difficult to transfer or jump between immunology to neuroscience?
I would say no. I think those prior skills give you an advantage in a slightly different field, and there's going to be lots of overlap in that field. So we used to kind of separate everything out into, neuroscience and the gut and immunology, and everything had its own little boxes. And I think that concept is really eroded now. We're talking about the gut-brain axis and the way the gut and the brain work together, and they're not two separate things anymore. And the same way that what's going on with your immune system is influencing how we think, and influencing the way those brain regions change. And so any kind of scientific background is going to be an advantage into the next sort of slight shift in the field that you're going into. And I think that breadth is really important. So you've probably positioned yourself really well to do really well in neuroscience if you've got that background.
And Sarah, I know that you have children, you have a family. So what has it been like, and what has your experience been balancing your career with your family, especially given all the travel that's involved?
Yes, it's not easy. I have a wonderful husband who takes up the slack when I'm not either not physically present because I'm overseas or something like that, or just sort of not mentally present because I'm working on a grant and I need to do this right now. So I think having that social support, whether it's a partner or family or something like that, is really, really essential. As Kylie was saying, you have to love this job because it demands a lot of you, and it's certainly not easy to balance sometimes. But I think my kids give me some sort of perspective, puts my work into perspective, I guess, and stops me getting too entrenched in the work. So it's useful. It comes back to me as useful as well.
Forcing you to take a break, not working too hard.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Kylie, what about yourself, having travelled around a lot? Has it been challenging?
But there's always challenges with it, right? I think I have probably approached a few of my moves with this naivety and just rolled with it. But there's always challenges along the way, and it's being far from your friends and family is a challenge. And being, you get separated from your traditional support networks. And so, you move into a new environment and all of a sudden you have to find your mentors and your sponsors again and find a support network to help your career progress and find a support network to help you just deal with life and all of those sorts of things. So, for sure, it's a challenge each time you move to a new environment, but it's an opportunity to broaden your network, meet new people, develop as a person. I think I grew a lot as a person having to have a few shifts in there. But it's like Sarah said, it demands a lot of you, but there is definitely you grow as a person.
Yeah, mentors, support networks, super important. So, Kylie, how do you find mentors and people to support you, and what kind of support do they give?
Like mentors, I guess people who are sort of thinking about these sorts of things, we define mentors as someone who can kind of give you advice and give you that professional perspective, and then sponsors are people who can actually help you out, who put you forward for things and will give you opportunities. And I think, sometimes those people are the same person, sometimes they're not the same person, sometimes they're your supervisor, sometimes they're not your supervisor, sometimes they're your peers, right? And I think you have to just develop a number of different mentors and sponsors, develop a team. It takes time. You've got to ask people sometimes and reach out and say, hey, I need help. Some people are good at giving advice on particular topics and not really great on giving advice on other topics. And so you've just got to be aware of different people's strengths, what they bring to the table in terms of their advice, and develop your team. Yeah, but it takes some time, but yeah, reaching out and asking is definitely a way to do it.
And I certainly sort of see you as, one of my role models and mentors, and sort of comes full circle. Sarah, how do you find support networks and what sort of support do you look for?
I think that they tend to evolve naturally rather than it being these sort of, for a while the universities got very keen on setting up these partnerships that were mentoring kind of partnerships, and I think they don't work as well as ones that you kind of find yourself, because you really need to find a common wavelength with a person and get have them be giving you advice that you can take on board and you trust and all of that sort of thing. So I think these relationships can't really be forced, and but they're certainly necessary, and you find them as you go through. I mean, hopefully when you start off your career, you have really good mentorship in your supervisors, and generally you'll have a supervisory team, so there's more than one of them, and if one of them isn't so great, the other one might be. That's a really good scenario, and that was probably my experience, that having that really good mentorship from the start is a really good kick along the way, and then you form relationships with their friends and their networks, and they will introduce you to people and give you opportunities, and so those networks expand. As I mentioned before, international partnerships and mentorships and networking is really important, not just the Australian version. And so seeing people face to face in the real world is the way to do that. And as Kylie said, people love to be asked, and no one's going to be upset with you if you ask them for help. They're going to be flattered to be asked, and most people will give up their time and will be happy to impart their experiences. So I think, you have to, they do evolve naturally, but you do have to put yourself out there and create the space for those relationships to evolve.
Definitely. And now we can even invite people out for a cup of coffee.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm wondering what kind of impacts you think COVID-19 is having on women in academia. Obviously, you both have very different experiences. Maybe Sarah, we'll start with you. You've had to homeschool two children. How has COVID-19 impacted you?
Like a lot of other Australians, like a lot of particularly Victorians, I did about 6 months of homeschooling with two children who are 9 and 6, and that was very challenging. It was challenging for them as well. They didn't like it much either. But you're trying to hold down a full-time job and essentially do another half-time job. So yeah, I certainly don't want to revisit that one. I think apart from that, the lockdown and the COVID situation from a job perspective has been fairly manageable. I think if it hadn't been for that, the transition to working from home has been relatively smooth. And with all the technology, it's possible to still support your students and all of that sort of thing. I have been involved with a little bit of work looking at the impact of COVID on publishing for women, and so across on a world stage, it has actually seemed to have impacted women more than it has men in terms of their ability to publish during this time. And the data that we have on that are really early, because as you guys know, if you're involved in science, it takes a really long time for you to decide on an idea for a paper and then do the experiments and then write it up and get it reviewed and all of this sort of thing. So we're not yet seeing the full impact of the lockdown on things like publishing, because these things are quite a protracted process. So I think the early data suggesting that this process has impacted women more than it has men in terms of their ability to publish is really frightening, because we can see it even now. So I think those conversations need to be had, and we need to try and sort of figure out what we can do about this not having a longer term impact on women's careers.
I think, Kylie, you've written 1 or 2 articles on this sort of topic as well. And also, in this period, you've been sort of one of the go-to people in the media and talking about communication around vaccines and the virus. So what has this period been like for you?
It's been pretty unusual. It's, I've been working from home predominantly. I've sort of had a little bit of access to work, but it's been really challenging to get in. And that's been, I think particularly for people who are early in their career, who don't have, this was supposed to be my year of generating data in my new lab. And I think it's been a real challenge to be able to do that, and challenging for my students. It's really tough on the students, I think, in particular. I think, there's been really important work. I love the fact that Sarah's sort of involved in these initiatives that are collecting hard data on how this is impacting women. That's so important to get the metrics. because it's persuasive, and it puts numbers behind the anecdotal sort of stories that we're hearing. And we know rationally that, women, well, there are certain sectors, certain demographics within our community that are disproportionately being impacted by COVID-19 and redundancies and these sorts of things, or lack of contracts, those sorts of things. So people who have high teaching loads, people who are early in their career, and people who have caring responsibilities are bearing the brunt of this. And all of those groups are also disproportionately women. And so I think it's really important to understand the immediate effects of COVID, but as Sarah said as well, understand the long-term effects of COVID, and how we can really support our entire community as best we can through this experience. But yeah, in terms of the interaction with the public and interaction with the media and stuff like that, that for me has been a really nice outlet. It's been wonderful to be able to use my skills and communicate in a way that I hope is helping the public understand what's going on around them. It's such a challenging time with lots of information. It's information overload. Everything's changing so quickly. It's really, it's difficult for a scientist to navigate, let alone a member of the public for whom all of this is really new knowledge and a new area and new space. So look, I think it's a real privilege to be able to, help people along that journey. And I have been quite heartened by some of the experiences I've had with the journalist fraternity. So I've been meeting more folks who work in health and medicine, journalism. There are some incredible people, just really knowledgeable, incredible skill sets, really switched on and really focused on informing the public and giving them access to really good knowledge. And something that I do really appreciate, given today's context, is that a lot of these journalists are really making a conscious decision and a conscious effort to put young women, people of colour, people of diverse backgrounds in front of the public who are experts in this topic. And I think it's so important with vaccination that the public understands that these vaccines are being made for them by people like them. That it's really important that the people who are communicating to you about vaccines are people who you would understand would be in your social circle and have your best interests at heart. And so I love that journalists are seeking out diverse voices, and I really appreciate that and support that going forward.
Thank you. One thing that you mentioned was, the idea of supporting each other and women supporting women. And Kylie, you are the Australian and New Zealand Society for Immunology's Women's Initiative Coordinator. So what is that role, and why do we need roles like that?
That particular role, it's within our professional society. So it's immunologists across, so researchers and educators across Australia and New Zealand who focus on immunology. So within that role, my particular role as the Women's Initiative Coordinator is to facilitate a few different things. So there's the Women's Initiative more broadly contains things like awards that are targeting women or non-binary or non-gender conforming individuals. We've got a speaker database to make sure that people can access people. So women who can speak from an expert perspective on different topics related to immunology. We have resources on the website. We organise events around equity, diversity and inclusion for our community. And we advise on different topics. So we've got a gender equity policy, for example, as part of our professional society. And part of the role is to collect those metrics, understand how we're doing. Are we getting the speaker gender equity? Are we getting, the representation within our events that we want to see? So I think that's basically the role. And I guess it's important just to to keep the conversation going. I think that's this kind of a role is all about communicating and keep having conversations with people. We know that, everyone has biases, everyone has things that are just not within their sightline and don't register to them. And so it's important just to prompt the conversation, to keep these issues around gender equity at front of mind so that people can be aware of their behaviours and what they're doing that may not be particularly active in supporting women, and think of things where they could more actively support women within the STEM community.
Certainly the data that you sort of generate as part of that, and the data that you're generating, Sarah, in terms of publishing will be super fascinating to see. Sarah, Daniela has just graduated from a PhD and is now transitioning into the next phase of a career in neuroscience, whether it's academia or industry. Do you have any advice for someone who's in that phase of their career?
I guess pick your collaborators carefully comes to mind. So you'll meet a lot of people and have a lot of conversations about working together. And I think it becomes a little bit of a skill to learn how much energy to put into each of those. I've worked with some absolutely amazing collaborators, and it's been very productive, and you have these conversations that actually turn into something, right? Experiments or student exchanges or publications together. On the other hand, you have a lot of conversations that just become nothing, and it's part of the process, and that's not every idea is going to be a worthy one. But you can also spend quite a lot of time working with people who are not meeting you halfway. So I think that there's just a little bit of a screening process or something. If you feel like you're putting a lot of energy into working with someone and not getting that energy back, then maybe it's time to put more energy into other places. The standing sort of advice when you're starting, you're making that transition, is to say yes to everything. Was the advice that I was given. And saying yes to everything is a really hard habit to get out of once you've gotten through this period of everything being useful to you. You tend to retain this habit of saying yes, even when these things are no longer useful to you or no longer a great use of your time. So I would just possibly take up every opportunity that you're offered and definitely go with that if it makes sense, but be aware of that transition as you sort of transition through your career, that not everything you do will have the same value in terms of turning into an output or a useful connection or things. So you just have to be a little bit savvy about the choices that you make in that regard.
Irene asks whether either of you have been inspired by the recognition of the work that Elizabeth Blackburn received or did and then received acknowledgement when she shared the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine in 2009. So has that inspired you, or I might add to that question, do the successes of other people inspire you? Who inspires you?
Absolutely. I think it's really, as Kylie was saying about the journalism experience that she was having, it's really inspiring to see people who are like you in various ways doing well and having these great ideas and their great techniques and translating that into something tangible and being recognized for it. Especially, I think, if you can see things that have been a little bit challenging in your own life. I'm going to use kids as an example. It's not a very strong example because I don't think my kids have been that detrimental to my career, but it's certainly been a little bit different having children and seeing other women who have similarly have children and sort of navigated that and been able to be really successful scientists and successful mothers as well is really inspiring. So I think finding not just women obviously, but other people that do well that you can sort of see parallels with your own life, and I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, Elizabeth Blackburn in the field of biology of aging is like, she's a god. And I mean, she has such an interesting story, right? And she's, Tasmanian. It's like a whole host of homegrown hero kind of stuff. It's great. But she does have a really interesting story that she's such a prolific scientist, has made so many different discoveries, and particularly in the field of aging. You know, she discovered how telomerase works. She was a co-discoverer of that. But it is really interesting to see her career path, and that she did have challenges along the way. She wasn't always recognised for many of the contributions that she made, but I think the overall weight of her impact has been recognised, and it is really, it's inspiring to see those women who were, I guess, within science, in earlier sort of periods, who must have encountered much more challenging situations, and got to a point where they're really such impactful people within the field. It's definitely great to see. But yeah, I think it can also be a heavy burden on some of those women who are who reach those heights, who have had to encounter a lot of really gender related challenges within the field and other challenges, but who are then often also looked to solve all the issues and be everyone's mentor and those sorts of things. So I think those people are really inspiring for sure. But I think it would be nice to lift the weight from them a little bit, so they didn't have to, do so much work.
We need to break that glass ceiling and then have a whole lot more people who can be inspiring role models to everyone come through. Yeah,
exactly.
Kylie, how stressful is it when you talk to a lay audience, particularly when talking to journalists and communicating in a field where there's already an established, entrenched crank network, is how the question's phrased, like anti-vaxxers. Particularly when you're talking to the media, do you have to feel like you're watching every word because you're worried that they might spin what you say?
You do have to be conscious of what you're saying. I think that's really important. But I think you should also trust the public, that they can be okay with a level of uncertainty. And I think that this whole situation with COVID-19 has been so fast moving, so challenging, that information has changed regularly. And I think the public, initially it was really, unsettling. But I think now the public's becoming a little bit more comfortable with the fact that we don't always know all the answers. We don't have everything, all figured out, but there are people who are working on it. So I think, you have to trust the public and communicate where there is uncertainty as well, and that's fine. But I think with the anti-vaxxer thing, it's with vaccines, there has always been a really challenging kind of social overlay, and that it interacts with so many unexpected other perceptions of health and social structure, all these sorts of things. But the vast majority of people who are cautious about vaccines are what we call vaccine hesitant. So vaccine hesitant just means that they're not sure and they need more information. And so if you give those people more information, then those questions can hopefully resolve that for them. So it's just really important to think about your audience and who you're talking to. And some people will be, very extreme in their views, and you won't shift that, and that's fine. But you do need to give good information to the people who want information, who welcome that information. And so that's kind of how I view my role. So,
Sarah, you've been leading a lab and you've just been promoted, which is amazing. Congratulations. What was it like, transitioning from being an early career researcher to now you're running your own group and you're, in charge and the boss of all these people and having to manage that as well?
Well, it doesn't happen overnight. So you don't go from being a PhD student, or maybe there are some people that do, but not for not very many people. For most people, it will take years to get to the point where you're running big budgets and lots of people, and you're responsible for a team of students and their PhDs and their careers and the postdocs and their careers and things. So you learn along the way. And a colleague of mine gave a talk a year or so ago where he posted this lovely slide of all of the things that we do as scientists, and you end up sort of becoming accountants and counselors to your students, and all this whole host of things that you do, because you have to manage budgets and day-to-day projects and people's work-life balance, and there's writing and presenting graphs and things in appropriate ways, and there's doing this sort of thing where you're interfacing with an audience, and like huge range of skills that you learn, but you learn them as you go through, and you get better, hopefully get better and better at them. It's you do feel a bit responsible, especially when funding is really hard to get and you have people who are relying on that funding for their continued career progression. Suddenly you're sort of responsible for them having a job, which is a little bit daunting, I guess. And yes, certainly we're responsible for the students coming through and making sure that they get a really good experience, and not only learning the skills that they need to learn to progress in science or whatever career that they want to pursue, but just having a good time with it and enjoying what they're doing, and being sort of supported to manage their PhDs or whatever they're doing with the rest of their lives and things as well. So yeah, it's skills that you learn along the way.
And a question that I might pose to both of you is, how would you like to see the field of biomedical research change over the next 50 years? And maybe you can start off broad with biomedical research and then also think about your specific field. So Kylie, do you want to kick us off with an answer for that one?
Yeah, oh gosh, there's so many things. Look, I think it's hard to think about the next 50 years, I think, when I do think we're in a really challenging time in Australia, I guess, at the moment. There's been COVID's caused a lot of financial pressures on different institutions, and so there has been all these different impacts. We're losing a bit of our workforce, and a decent chunk of our workforce, and that's it's quite scary right now. So I would like to see, and I've sort of working in the field of vaccine research, I understand what a long-term commitment it is to funding, consistent funding to build up a field and build up an understanding of a specific technology to the point that it can be a vaccine at the end of things, and so I would love to see more consistent funding, more consistent support of the research sector, I guess, here in Australia, and more interaction with, support for our ability to interact with groups around the world and really plug ourselves into that international community and keep the ideas flowing. But I think COVID's also sort of highlighted some of the things, the ways that those interactions can change, and I would love to be able to travel and have the option, but sometimes normalizing the Zoom interactions and that distance interaction that's been really good. I've felt plugged into some conversations which I otherwise wouldn't have been, which is great. And yeah, I guess for me, working in this field, it's been really interesting to watch the emergence of open access science and preprints. So science has been moving so quickly with COVID-19 that a lot of the most impactful, relevant research is what we call preprints. So that is a person can write a manuscript, and instead of having it published through a journal, then it's posted on an online forum, and anyone can look at it, anyone can read it, anyone can comment on it, which has become really interesting. So it can become quite challenging because those preprints haven't been peer reviewed, so they haven't gone out to the scientific community when they're posted to have a level of quality control. But at the same time, you're hearing back very quickly from the scientific community as to what they think about it. And so I think that's been really interesting to watch this year, and I would love to see how that model goes forward and how we get that freer and freer discussion in real time of our work so that hopefully we can accelerate progress.
So I think what we're going to see is much more integration between disciplines and much less of the siloing that I talked about earlier. So lots more interdisciplinary research, and that just becoming completely normal and not even something that you have to promote as a plus. It would just be completely normal to work with engineers when you're a neuroscientist and such. So I think 50 years we'll see a lot more of that. I would like to see some changes in the way science is funded in Australia. And it's very easy to say that because I don't have any very strong ideas for what to change it into. But currently it's very difficult for basic science research to get funded. The success rate is very low. And we're putting a lot of money into translational research, which is great. The public wants to see something that's fixed right now, fixed as soon as possible. But as Kylie was saying, it takes years to get to that point where you've got something that works. Even with the entire world working on this project, it's still nearly 18 months and we haven't got the vaccines nailed. So, and this is with massive amounts of resources. And so you can imagine with something that is less in the public eye that we're not piling those massive resources into. We're talking years and years and years to come from basic science research into a translatable product. And if we don't fund that basic science research, in 10 years' time, we're going to have nothing to translate. So I feel like that model needs to be worked out so that there's more of a balance there. Obviously, I'd like to see it be some gender equity and things like publishing. I mean, even COVID aside, we know that there are fewer women publishing in the biomedical sciences in total as senior authors, and in particular in those really big journals. And whether that's because of networking or other reasons, we don't really understand that. But I'd like to see that getting a lot better as the decades progress, and hopefully it doesn't take decades. Yeah.
Sarah and Kylie, thank you for sharing your stories, your experiences and insights into what it's like to work as a female biomedical researcher. So everyone, I hope you have a lovely afternoon as you continue celebrating the International Day of Women and Girls in Science.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Kat.